Okay, so today we have Clint Robinson with us. To the viewers out there who perhaps don't follow surf ski paddling or kayaking, Clint has claimed a gold, silver and bronze at 5 Olympic Games in sprint kayaking. He's winner of 15 Australian surf ski titles and is world champion. He's the world and 5 times Australian board champion, and he's the 3 times world ocean surf ski champion. Now, Clint, your achievements are absolutely incredible. How have you managed to achieve such success against such tough competition?
Well, I grew up through surf lifesaving after I finished playing football. So when I was young, I was a runner and a football player, and my father was involved in lifesaving. So he basically introduced me to the sport from about 8 or 9 years of age while I was still playing football. And I, after representing in the State of Origin series, which is a pretty powerful football series here in Australia, as a young under 13, I decided that I didn't want to play football anymore because I wanted to be an Olympic athlete. And I loved surf lifesaving, and the paddling side of it is what my father did, and I used to watch him when I was a young child, and I always felt quite drawn to paddling, so I wanted to try it. So I gave up football when I was 13 and a half and started down the Olympic road after watching the Moscow Olympic Games the year before. And I said to my father I wanted to be the first Australian to ever win an Olympic gold medal in kayaking. And he said, what about marathon paddling or some of these other long distance events? And I said, no, the best athletes in the world in paddling are sprint paddlers by miles, and I want to race the best athletes in the world. And that was always my dream. So I feel very fortunate to have been able to follow that journey for about 24 years.
Okay, at the moment, I know that you're training for the Molokai long distance surf ski race. First of all, if you can explain to the audience what that race is and how your preparation is coming along.
Yeah, I'll talk about my preparation first because that's pretty easy. It's not really existent. I'm going to Hawaii this year to primarily have meetings with all the Epic bosses about a lot of developments in the surprise products that are coming out with Epic in the next 6 months. And I'm also doing all the testing with Greg Barton the week after the race for the new V12 that we've designed for the last 6 months. Fen did a great thing by making a few small tweaks to their elite ski, calling it the Elite S, and they really did jump everybody with a downwind boat. So this is firmly going to be our answer back to challenge Fen and the global sales of a true downwind paddling boat that Epic have never really built in the past. So that's the main focus for the trip. The preparation, I only finished the national championships for rowing and canoeing, and also for surf lifesaving 4 weeks ago. So I paddled for 3 weeks, so that's my training for Molokai, to be honest. And as I said, if there's a bit of wind, I think I can be competitive, but I'll go across there and race as hard as I can. But I'm 44 years old now, and with 3 weeks training, you have to be realistic. So if I was able to do well in the race this year, yeah, that'd be a real surprise, I think.
Okay, best of luck either way. So I know you started off your career as a sprint kayaker. How have you found the transition to long distance surf ski paddling?
Well, after training for sprint racing for 28 years straight, people don't quite understand the difficulties, because when you're a sprint paddler you have a lot of explosive muscle, and that muscle is not designed to go for 3 and 4 hours at a time. So the reason I've always enjoyed the Molokai ski race is for 2 parts. One, because I think it's the foundering race of the sport, and no disrespect to any other race in the world, but I don't believe any of them come close. I think it is the true beginning of ocean skis, and that's what attracts me because I love ocean paddling. Molokai also is like a number of other beautiful island places in the world. It's just fantastic to paddle there. So I keep going back for this race primarily because I believe it is important, and it is important to support the race that I believe is the beginning and to nurture the tradition of the sport. I also have had a lot of difficulties doing this race because I have a muscle body type that was trained for nearly 3 decades to be a 3-minute paddler, and now I try and race for 4 hours. So the compositions and the difficulties that I have to include in that race for me to do well in it is really tough. And no excuses, but I'm definitely not a bred sprint paddler. I'm definitely not a bred marathon paddler. I'm far too heavy and too big to be a great marathon paddler, but if there's an ocean and a runner out there, I'll try and challenge anybody there that's to try and win the race.
What is one of your greatest achievements in sport and why?
My first ever Australian championship is my most proudest moment in sport, because I always wanted to be a national champion from when I was 5 years of age. I said to my father, even that young, I watched a running race. It's called a stall gift in Australia, where people run in a staggered start to be the fastest athlete on handicap in Australia. And I watched an Australian presentation take place after that race, and I said to my father, I would love to be a national champion, Dad. And he said, do you know what that means? And I said, yes, to be the best person in your country, in your sport. So it was from that age that I really, really was drawn to want to do well as a national competitor. But I think the greatest achievement of all time is definitely to be Olympic champion in 1992, because I was racing Greg Barton, who was the current Olympic champion, and Knut Holman, who is the greatest, I believe, kayak paddler in any form of the sport, by being the most successful sprint racer of all time. He was the two-time current world champion going into the Olympic Games in Barcelona, and the other guy out of the four of us that raced for the gold medal that day was a guy called Marian Popescu, who was the current junior world champion. So I was the nobody amongst all the Olympic and world champions, and from my way of thinking, that was certainly the greatest achievement of my career from a stats point of view.
Now, for the audience who perhaps doesn't know, I'm actually interviewing Clint from South Africa, and he's in Australia at the moment. We've got a lot of enthusiastic South African paddlers, and they would love to know, what is one great training drill to improve surf ski technique?
Yeah, look, I think the thing that's very important is that there's two parts to that equation. One, you must acquire correct weight distribution in your technique, which is very important, and very few people understand this, which is why I started doing educational clinics 5 years ago to help a lot of people with their stability in the ocean. And two, you must go out and play a lot going into and with the ocean. So you need to have a series of efforts where you might go 10 minutes out and then work the runners coming back towards that starting point. So you're getting a good composition of using these particular balanced technical skills with power and your weight distribution on your ski in order to handle water that you're going into and water that you're going with. And they are true arts that I have certainly worked on for over 30 years of paddling, and I teach a lot of people that I'm responsible for coaching these days.
Okay, how do you approach training sessions when you don't feel motivated?
Motivation for me has never been a problem, and that's the honest truth. I have never slept in and thought, oh God, who cares, that doesn't really matter today, or I've woken up and thought, I'm just too tired, I'm not going to do it. I've always been an athlete that will get up and go and do the session. The session may not be the best I can possibly do because I'm tired or exhausted or I'm a bit sick or something, but unless I'm physically ill where I can't achieve anything by doing the session, I'll go and do it. And I've been the same since I was 7 years old. My father had a rule that he would never come and wake me up to go training. So if I didn't wake him up, we would never ever go. And in 8 years training before I was Olympic champion, I only ever slept through my alarm twice in 8 years. So from a 13-year-old to a 21-year-old athlete. So I wanted to be Olympic champion and I made that happen.
That's a great approach to training. So what are 3 exercises in the gym that you recommend to improve paddling strength?
Okay, if you're a young person and you've been doing some gym, I think the basic full-length proper chin-up under good control speed is a very good exercise. If you're a bit of an older athlete or you've got small shoulder niggles or something like that, a seated lateral pull-down is a very, very good exercise that complements very similar muscles but just doesn't put the shoulder through as much stress. I think another area that you need to be careful of is you need to do enough chest work, because the sport often works the pulling muscles of your arms and back a lot. And if you don't work your chest muscles and keep your postural position in with good integrity, you'll end up getting a lot of rotator cuff problems in the front of your shoulder and a lot of niggles over time. So it's very important to work your chest in a variety of different chest exercises, and there's quite a lot that I do educate my paddlers on. And then of course there's the torso. You need to do, paddling is not a pulling sport. That's where most of the paddling community that aren't educated learn a lot when we do clinics with them. Greg Barton and I have just done a 3-part series online to educate paddlers that paddling is a rotation sport. So if you don't have a strong core, you will never be a good, sustainable speed paddler.
How would you describe your mental approach when it comes to racing?
It's pretty simple. If you worry about all the small stuff that can happen, you'll probably end up losing a lot of energy concerning yourself with things that may not even take place. So concentrate on things that you can control. And I love the fight. So if I see Corey Hill, Hank McGregor, David Mookie, Jasper, Sean Rice, the more names, the better I race. Because I absolutely love the challenge of racing good athletes that are on their game trying to win it for their own credibility. And I've always loved that fight against competitors, always very fairly. Oscar's been a great competitor over the years and he's a really great fighter. He loves to win. So racing against all those types of guys. But I would have to say, people that I've never been more motivated to race anybody than I was to race Knut Holman, because I regard him to be the greatest athlete I've ever competed against. So people like that motivate me a lot to try and do well.
What type of food would you eat on a typical training day?
Yeah, I have, my diet's pretty simple really. I have a small amount of carbs, but I usually eat 3 base red meat meals a day. And then I just have lots of snacks of things during the day. So if I'm training pretty hard for a race, which I don't do hardly ever anymore these days, but back in my days when I was, doing quite a lot as an athlete, I would have, heavy protein breakfasts of eggs and chops or bacon or steak or whatever it may have been that I had at the time that I'd shot for. Lunchtime would be sometimes a whole chicken and then a plate of salad. And for evening meals, I'd have between 500 to 750 grams of red meat and usually, a fairly big, large plate of vegetables with it. During meals, I'd have fruits, sometimes just barely basic fruits that had low acidity, like berries and apples and things like that. And then I'd also have some almonds and a bit of yogurt and stuff like that from time to time. So a pretty basic diet wrapped up with a lot of carnivore theories from our yesteryears of our ancestors. And I don't believe in all this carb loading crap, to be honest with you. I don't get into it at all. I've never believed in it. It's never helped me when I've done it. And I've seen a lot of other athletes operate very well off high protein intake diets.
I hear you mentioned low acidity. Can you elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, well, certain fruits, especially that a lot of people eat, like they think there's been crazes of health where you go through and have, oranges and pineapple and you juice them all up and that's your breakfast. Well, it's the worst possible thing to do to your stomach because it creates fruits that are very high in acidity, and your stomach needs a balance of alkaline in order to digest properly and control your mucosal linings that protect your healthy digestive system. And when you go and do that, it just throws it into AWOL. And fruits are often things that are just saturated with water and very little else once it's digested. So you get a very short-term level of satisfaction from it. So fruit, in my way of education that I've been brought up through all the key nutritionists that I've worked with, fruit is an additive to what we have, and a low acidity-based fruit is very, very important to have so you can have a very stable balance and digestive system.
Okay, and is hydration important whilst you train?
Yes, it is. I mean, that differentiates a lot on the particular person, because I know people that have paddled Molokai with no water and they finished in the top 3 of the race. So, Dean Gardner's a classic. We call him the camel because Dean's paddled Molokai a ton of times and hasn't even drunk 400 or 500 mils of water. And then other people like myself and others who are high heat athletes, because we got a lot of muscle fibre from sprint racing, might drink up to 4 litres of water. So it very much is an individual type of thing that people get used to training with. If you're in a cold climate, you don't often require anywhere near the fluids because you don't sweat anywhere near as much. But if you're going to race in a hot climate and you haven't done that a lot in the past, or you've prepared in a cold climate and then you travel for a hot race, certainly I wouldn't advise anybody to go out there without a decent amount of water in case they find that they're getting in a bit of trouble, because dehydration can be quite fatal.
So when you do most of your training sessions, you would have something to drink while you train?
Yeah, I usually have something to drink, but I certainly drink more when I race than what I do when I train.
Okay.
Because when you're racing, you're operating at a very high level for a long time. And when you're training, you're doing large periods of volume over given periods of time during the week. So, and you're including, you know, whether it be gym and cross training like cycling and running and swimming and, you know, on water strength training, all those cross training elements that are directly related to the paddling form at its purity, you know, when it's a hot climate, take a lot out of you.
Should you have protein powder after you train?
Once again, that's a very personal thing. I prefer to eat, yes, I have used it a lot when I was a full-time athlete, because I was using protein powder before session, after session, and then eating protein meals, because I have a very high metabolism, so I just burn through food like there's no tomorrow. I can't eat enough to keep weight on when I'm training at a very high level for an Olympic game type performance. But, you know, for most people, I would say if you're eating a good protein breakfast, if you feel a little bit hungry during your session, you could probably have a small protein shake before your session, about half an hour before. But you don't really want to be on the water feeling hungry, because that means you're eating into a lot of your vital stores.
What advice can you give to people who want to achieve their best? And the reason why I asked that question is because I noticed when I raced in Australia a lot, the competition was a lot higher in a lot of the sports. And I'm finding in South Africa, we seem to have a lot of talent, but we aren't pushing that talent through.
And, you know, I've come through 30 years, so I've seen South Africa come and go on a lot of different levels of different sports of surf lifesaving and canoeing, and now ocean ski racing. South Africa have a very good top 1%, and then they have a fair void underneath that, where what you find in Australia is Australia have like a top 8 to 10% that are very good, you know, so you just get a higher volume of athletes because the competition here is at a high level, being pushed by a lot of major sponsors, and the Olympic movement with canoeing has kept our sprint paddling base a lot higher than what South Africa has, right? Because they just weren't involved in the games and things like that for a period of time. So, yes, I think it's vitally important to be able to understand, if you want to be successful, you need to understand where the pace is at. So what are the good athletes really capable of? And I don't believe in Australia or South Africa on a true international sport, which I don't really regard Ironman competition to be that. I regard a sport like sprint canoeing or swimming or something like that to be a true international sport. And I think if you want to know how fast you've really got to be, you've got to go to Europe and race. You've got to put yourself in environments where the level of competition you aspire to be at, you need to go and get in that game to understand what that really is, so that you can then train and use your coaching staff and your helpers to be able to create a plan for you to make that.
Prior to doing this interview with you, about an hour ago, I put a post on Facebook saying that I'm going to interview Clint Robinson, and if anyone would like to ask any questions, I would ask them on their behalf. So I do have 3 questions which I've picked out of a list. And the first one is from a gentleman called Andrew Neal, and he said, what is your normal paddle length size?
Okay, yeah, well, that varies quite a lot depending on the different paddle sport that I'm actually doing. So when I was racing Olympic K1s, it was about 2 metres 20 centimetres. When I'm racing sprint racing for surf lifesaving, it's about a 2:16. And when I'm doing a race like Molokai, it'll probably be about a 14. But what I should say is paddle length has a lot to do with paddle blade size. Now, I always use what I term, what I would call the German theory. Germans are the best technical nation in the world, and they use the best rotational base out of all their paddlers across the board. So they use a bigger blade because they're not using their arms as much to paddle correctly. So I tend to use, like for instance, like across the Molokai channel, I'd rate 10 to 12 strokes a minute less than Hank for every minute of the race. So, you know, we're very different technically, how we paddle, and Hank uses more of a marathon paddler's technique where he sort of chips away at a little bit more with smaller blades, and I just tend to rate a lot lower than Hank and just use the bigger blade less often to get the same speed. So it's just different theories and the way people like to go about it, but I paddle a lot more with that kayak paddling theory than the small choppy hack away at surf paddling type theory, you know.
Okay, second question from a gentleman called Matt Kalal. It says, Clint, what are your views on cross-discipline training, doing marathon and ski paddling while focusing on sprints versus a purist-only sprinter?
If you want to be the best you can possibly be as a sprinter, you won't go and train for marathons, or you won't go and do a lot of marathons. Why? They sap out a lot of resources that you do require in order to continually develop your power base and speed as a sprint paddler. You'll never, for instance, a perfect example, you won't ever go and see a 400 metre runner at the Olympic Games go and try and do marathons during the Olympic year. So muscles are designed and trained a certain way, and when you start throwing things in the middle of each other that are very cross-referencing, they can often limit the ability that you end up creating. So yes, while paddling in general offers so many scopes of great fun, if I was going for the Olympic Games, and every year I went to the Olympic Games out of the 5 Olympics I went to, that's why I never ever attended Molokai in any of those years. I never did any marathon ski races in any of those years. So, to be truly great sprinter, you have to very much focus your body type on being a great sprinter.
Okay, and the last question of the day is from Team Max Paddle, and they ask Clint, what training do you advise to improve endurance speed?
Yeah, endurance speed, the key to endurance speed is fartlek. So if you just go and grind out a lot of miles and you technically fall in a hole and you become very lackluster in the acceleration through your stroke, you don't ever generate a lot of endurance speed. If you do a lot of fartlek type training, like 30 seconds on, 30 off for, you might start for 60 minutes, you might build it up to 2 hours, depending on what type of race you're looking for. Then when you get better at it, you might do 40 seconds on, 20 seconds off, and then when you're preparing and you're close to a major event, you might go 45 seconds on, 15 seconds off. And you may have to break that down into 20-minute blocks with a small break after 20 minutes because it is quite exhausting. But if you want to go and race, this is the thing that's important with endurance speed. If you want to go and race a race that's an hour and a half long, you don't go and do the first 30, if you're doing a session of 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off. You're never going to do a 30-second piece in a marathon race flat out. So you need to understand what is the true race pace that you want to steady state your race at. So what's the good solid average speed you want to be running at? And when you do those fartlek type sessions, it might be 80% of your best or 84% of your best that you can hold for 2 hours by going 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off. So you need to understand what that pace is, and then you work on through speed or stroke rate, you work on achieving that pace in every one of those 30-second efforts that you might do in the session.
Clint, I really appreciate you taking the time to share your knowledge and your expertise in surf ski paddling and kayaking. I know a lot of the audience that will listen to this will appreciate you sharing those experiences. I wish you the best of luck in your upcoming season and your endeavours, and thank you so much for your interview today.
No worries, Wade, and all the best, mate. I hope the listeners get a little out of it.